So first of all, what we're going to be discussing today is we're going to be covering the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. But first of all, what I'd like to do literally in just one slide is kind of take a step back. This isn't strictly part of the Active IQ learning curriculum, but what I found and what the feedback has been from previous students is that kind of going over what we call this general adaptation syndrome is actually very useful, and it kind of parts the fog or the paralysis of analysis that generally occurs when you start out as a personal trainer, because obviously you've got all of these different exercises and you've got all of these different methods by which you can torture somebody. It's like, well, how do I figure out which one's the best kind of methods, or which one do I think is the best mediums or exercises to get the job done? I'll tell you a little story. Back around 3.5 billion years ago, you would have been one cell, right? A little unicellular life form. And the problem with that is that you would have been constrained by your size, right? So cells kind of form and then decay almost in the same way that like a bubble might, right? So you've got this cellular membrane and it has a certain surface to tension ratio. And when that gets too big, the cell ruptures and you get cell death. Okay, so an evolutionary strategy to overcome that is that you join up with lots of other cells. All right, so you end up becoming what we are, which is a multicellular organism. Now, the real utility of that is that you're no longer constrained by your size. Okay, and when you're not constrained by your size, it means that when one cell dies, another one forms. Okay, so you're no longer constrained by the life cycle of a single cell. And what that gives you is it gives you time. Now, time's an important thing, particularly from an evolutionary perspective, because with time, you get more opportunity to be exposed to different environments, right? So you can imagine, like, when you're there as this little multicellular thing kind of floating around the Earth's oceans, you're going to start coming across different environments. So let's say you started off on the bottom of the ocean, you might sort of drift to the surface, and then suddenly all the water pressure changes. You're now exposed to light for the first time. You're now exposed to higher temperatures for the first time. And then as evolution kind of speeds on, you then come on into land, you start experiencing gravity. You then start to get the basis of what we call predation, so predator and prey. So now not only are you having to deal with your environment, but you're now having to deal with other organisms as well. And so what happens is that because you've got so much time, you've got so much exposure to all these environments, your cells start to adapt. Okay, they become way more complex. And so some cells become particularly good at, say, registering heat. Some become really good at registering light, registering gravity. You start to get bones starting to form from cartilage. It's obviously, in order for you to be able to move sufficiently, you have to be able to contend with gravity, and not only contend with it, but actually impart a force on it to resist it with enough force to be able to actually move, right? And then obviously you develop vision and auditory capabilities, so your ears, taste buds, and so on. Now, the problem with this is that those complex single cells that you're now made up of, it doesn't just stop with them. It's not like you have certain cells that deal with light and that's all that they do, and that there's no kind of consequences for all the other cells of your body. There is this general response from the entire organism in response to those changing environments. So irregardless of where the stimuli is coming from, whether it's heat, sound, gravity, and so forth, your body registers it on a very general way across the board, okay? And this is what we call general adaptation syndrome. And I'll go into more detail with this in level 3 because it really helps to understand this when you come to writing programs and so on. But generally speaking, you could think of adaptation as having these sort of multitude of stages, right? So you have homeostasis, which is kind of fancy biological talk, meaning just the body's equilibrium, so the body in balance. So for instance, while we're sitting here viewing our laptops, we've obviously got light coming from the screen. You've got to listen to my monotonous voice in your ears. Hopefully none of it is too stressful that it's going to cause any significant change in your biology, right? But then you imagine while we're sitting here, let's say a tiger kind of came into your living room. suddenly you shit your pants and now you're freaking out and so on. And you go through what we call this alarm stage, meaning that there is a general response for the body, okay, in response to that significant stimulus. So the alarm reaction, well, imagine what would happen if a tiger came through. Your heart rate would go through the roof. You would start sweating. You would probably start producing lots of cortisol, lots of adrenaline. And this is going to prepare you to either run away or to fight with the tiger, in a very simplistic sort of way of expressing it. This is what we call your fight or flight system, right? That's usually the popularized version of that whole system. And that's regulated by what we call your sympathetic nervous system, which I'll teach you all about from our neurology lectures. You'll also get, at this point, a general depression in your immune system. And you will also get a serious decrease in your perception of pain. So your perception of effort and pain will reduce. And that's where you kind of hear these crazy stories of like moms being able to lift cars off of their babies and so on, because you can't really feel the pain so much, but at the same time, your body is just so pumped up with adrenaline that you're able to access these sort of muscle fibers that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to use. Now, hopefully you would be able to recover from that. So you could have this alarm reaction and then the tiger goes, and then hopefully you just restore yourself back to this homeostatic default point. The problem is imagine if that kept happening all of the time. Okay, every time you come to one of these lectures, a tiger jumps through the window. Now, eventually you're going to reach a point where, so long as you've obviously survived it, you're going to get to this resistance stage where maybe it doesn't have the same effect that it once did. So although you're still a little bit freaked out and your heart rate's going through the roof and so on, it's not as bad as what it used to be. Because, geez, I've dealt with loads of tigers now. I'm still scared, but I know it's not going to harm me. But then the downside of that is if that went on for months and months and months and months and there's no period of recovery, we reach this exhaustion stage, which is, the resistance stage. Our immune systems are way better off. We've obviously adapted in any sort of specific ways that might be needed to deal with that situation. But if we don't get the break in the recovery, exhaustion, complete depression of the immune system, depression psychologically, overtraining, potentially depending on what the original stimuli was, like if we were exercising all of the time. And it can, in extreme circumstances, obviously lead to death. So this is general adaptation syndrome. So this could be anything. Remember, any stress, heavy squat session, okay, 3 times per week for a month, we get a resistance stage. So more muscle mass put on, improved immune function, improved nervous system function. But if we just went for loads of squats every day, no rest, exhaustion. Okay, this could be a dramatic increase in heat, light. It could be psychological stress in terms of like you have a job that you hate and you're going in there 9 to 5 every day. You might go through a period of resistance where you're able to motivate yourself and get the job done. But again, if it's constant over time without any sort of break or any sort of negotiation of the resistance, like trying to alleviate it in some way, exhaustion. And the problem is, as I'll go into more detail when we come into level 3, is that when you have multiple stresses impacting your body at the same time, it doesn't take as much from one stressor to cause a change. And this is kind of like the insidious issue of 21st century life, right? Because you're going to be training, or you'll have a client come in and you're going to sit down and have a consultation with them. And they're going to tell you about their job that they don't like. They've got a wife or a husband who just kind of nags at them all the time. They've got kids who are crazy. Maybe they don't sleep properly. Maybe they don't enjoy their work. They hate the 9 to 5 grind. They sit in traffic all the time. Now, any one of those stresses on its own might have been absolutely fine and enough for them to deal with. But the fact that there are multiple smaller stresses at one time, we get the same reaction. Okay, so that's the important thing to realize with all of this, is just there's this general response from the body towards stress, irregardless of where that stress comes from. Okay, and so it's our job really as personal trainers to manage the stress, okay, at least to some degree within our scope of practice. All right, we're not PTs, we're just stress managers. So if you have a client who comes to you and they're in that state where they hate their lives, maybe it's not best to jump in with a 10 sets of 10 German volume training, kind of crazy so intelligent to have them doing 10 sets of 10 German volume training. Maybe it's not so appropriate to have them doing loads of burpees and loads of prowler and sled pushes and all the rest of it. So this is what we have to be mindful of when we're discussing our anatomy and physiology and when we're going to discuss the programming. So with that in mind, we're going to be discussing the circulatory system and the respiratory systems. The composition of blood. So the way you're thinking about the circulatory system is it's just one massive roadway by which lots of different nutrients and cells can get from one end of the body to the other. So again, 3.5 billion years ago, you were one cell big. It was easy to get oxygen from the atmosphere, okay? Because all that had to have happen was for oxygen to pass through your cell membrane, and there you go, Bob's your uncle. You're now able to synthesize energy. Now, obviously, we're a bit bigger than one cell. We have like trillions of cells. All we need to be able to do is develop a road network by which we can get oxygen from the air to the muscles that we're hoping to use. Now, the main sort of system in this road network is the blood. Okay, that's the thing that's doing the carrying. And it is composed of a multitude of different cells and nutrients and so on, such as red blood cells. So what we would call hemoglobin when you look at it in more sort of academic literature. So the red blood cells are obviously the key sort of transporter of oxygen. Okay, oxygen binds to hemoglobin, and that's when you get oxyhemoglobin. And that's the thing that's going to take the oxygen from your lungs towards your working muscles, where they're going to be synthesized in what we call a mitochondria to produce ATP, which means adenosine triphosphate. And that's kind of like the energy currency of the body, which we'll discuss in a bit more detail come the energy systems lecture. So important for transporting oxygen around the body. We then have white blood cells, which form part of our immune system. Okay, so they fight infection. And the immune system really, it's an underrated aspect of physiology, at least with regards to physiology in the context of personal training. We don't actually have a module on the immune system, so I try to weave it in when I can, because there's no adaptation, there's no muscle building or fat loss that occurs without at least some sort of function of the immune system. Okay, it's really important for your ability to just survive, as well as obviously, get your big biceps and butts and so on. We then have platelets, which obviously provide a clotting agent in the aid of prevention of blood loss. So when you get a paper cut or you scratch yourself to the point where you break the skin and then you sort of start leaking blood, the scab that you form is formed of platelets. Okay, so they clot everything up to stem blood flow, so obviously you don't bleed out everywhere. And then we have the plasma, which is essentially the straw-colored liquid portion of the blood. So sometimes you might see in hospitals and things like that, where they've separated the plasma from the blood. The blood's kind of like the red stuff, and then the plasma is this sort of white, beigey looking substance. So the next bit, we obviously have the heart, which is the main engine of the circulatory system. Okay, it's the thing that pumps through contraction the blood around the body and to the lungs. Now, hopefully it's fairly obvious where it is, located in the chest, slightly left of the center. And it's around the size of a fist. And like I mentioned, its function is to primarily pump blood around the body, although it seems with more research that's going on around the heart that it plays a role in your endocrine system as well. But we'll get on into that, into level 3. Now, the structure of the heart is relatively simple. Okay, you have 4 main muscular chambers. You have the 2 atria, and then we have these 2 ventricles. Okay, so imagining that this diagram, imagine I'm kind of facing you from your laptop. You then have the right atrium on this side, if you can see my cursor, and then the left atrium on this side, and then the 2 ventricles at the bottom. Now, blood always flows from the atrium to the ventricle. So atria is a Greek word. It kind of means like the opening up of a house. Okay, you would move, so you go from outside, walk into the house, and you would be in the atrium, kind of as an area for people to meet. So just think atria, entrance, that's where blood always goes into, and then it flows via these little valves that open up. Okay, and we'll get into more detail with those in level 3, into the ventricles, the 2 big chambers here. In more detail now, we have these two atria and two ventricles, we also have a bunch of arteries and veins coming in. So the biggest one of the body, the biggest artery of the body is the aorta. And that's where blood will travel from the left ventricle. So blood goes from the left ventricle into the aorta. And then that would pump blood around the whole body. Okay, so the entire system. And that's why we call it systemic circulation. And then all of that oxygen will be used up by the working muscles. It will then, the aorta, which will then flow into the arteries, which will then flow into capillaries, which are kind of teeny tiny blood vessels. They're only about 1 cell thick, which if you took a sheet of paper and you looked at the piece of paper from its edge and then divided that by 250, like that's how small it is. And I'll kind of get into why that's important in a second. So just think, left ventricle, aorta, goes out to the entire body. Okay, so all of the working muscles that are being used, the organs that require blood flow at that period of time. The aorta then moves into smaller arteries, which then go into arterioles, which are even just smaller versions of those arteries, and then into capillaries, which are the tiniest. And then say within a muscle, you'll get a bed of capillaries that allow blood to adequately flow into the muscle. And then oxygen gets used up in the mitochondria, and then carbon dioxide gets put back out into those empty red blood cells. And then the carbon dioxide, so the deoxygenated blood, because now there's no oxygen in it, comes back up through the venules and then into veins and then into these two big, thick veins here called your vena cava. So in anatomical terms, whenever something is on top, it's what we would call superior. And whenever something is on the bottom, it's called inferior. So you kind of have these two veins by which deoxygenated blood can flow into the right atrium, into the right ventricle, and then that contracts and it pumps blood out through the pulmonary artery, which is the only artery in the body that handles deoxygenated blood. Okay, kind of remember those key little points because that's where the exams try and get you. Pulmonary basically means lungs, simply put. So the pulmonary artery obviously takes the blood up to the lungs, by which we can then deposit the carbon dioxide back into the lungs and then take on the oxygen that we've just breathed in. And that is what you would call pulmonary circulation. All right, so systemic circulation to the whole body, the whole system, and then pulmonary circulation just going to the lungs and back. All right, two different types of circulation. Now, what's interesting here, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying about stress and adaptation. If you look at the left ventricle here, so hopefully you can see my cursor to the left ventricle, and this bit, you'll notice that there is more muscle around the outside of the left ventricle than there is the right ventricle. Okay, so then you imagine yourself, okay, well, why is that the case? Well, it requires way more force to pump blood to the whole body, considering how tall you are, than it does to just pump blood to the heart, to the lungs, right? Therefore, more stress on this muscle compared to that muscle, therefore this muscle is larger. Okay, now that's kind of a useful thing to know because that's one of the key adaptations that take place with cardiovascular training, right? Particularly endurance training, or if you do very high intensity interval training. Because if I'm able to have a bigger, stronger, more muscular left ventricle, I'm going to be able to pump blood out way harder than what I would have ordinarily been able to pump out, right? That in tandem with having a left ventricle that is able to expand more, okay, which is what we call left ventricle end diastolic volume. So I'm able to expand my left ventricle more, therefore more blood can pool in the left ventricle. I then have a stronger left ventricle that can contract harder. I can then pump more blood out in 1 beat per minute. In 1 beat. And that means stroke volume, okay? So stroke volume, how much blood can you pump out in 1 beat? Now, when you times that by beats per minute, which is the unit of measurement for your heart rate, you then get cardiac output, right? So there's a key term for you to know. So stroke volume, the amount of blood pumped in 1 beat times beats per minute equals cardiac output. And so one of the mechanisms by which we get better at endurance training, we're able to run longer and faster, is that our left ventricles become way more efficient at pumping blood. And that's kind of like the main key predictor of endurance success, at least among elite level athletes. So for instance, imagine like I was running in a marathon race with an elite marathon runner. The thing that would separate us most would be what we call our VO2 max, which is basically your ability to uptake oxygen and then use it for fuel. So obviously the elite marathon runner is going to have a way higher VO2 max, kind of like up into the 70s and 80s of liter of oxygen per minute. Whereas mine at the moment, sitting around in lockdown for 2 weeks, is probably around maybe the 50s and 60s. But let's say we introduced another elite level marathon runner. The research would say that the thing that would separate those two would be whoever's got the left ventricle that can expand the most and then can contract the hardest. So here's just some nice diagrams kind of explaining what's happening in pulmonary circulation. So we have our lungs here, so a pulmonary venule, that's this big red thing. So you'll see kind of like this would be like the pulmonary artery, say, and then it forms into these tiny little capillaries, which are 1 cell thick, and it wraps around what we call an alveoli, which is essentially an air sac in the lungs. And I'll go into more detail on that in a few slides' time. The alveoli is also 1 cell thick. So you have these two tiny structures kind of wrapped around each other. The utility of that is that there's this thing called Dalton's law, if you remember back to chemistry in high school, which basically states that when there is sufficient pressure coming from two different gases, in this instance, oxygen and carbon dioxide, then they will pass through a partially permeable membrane, which is what the alveoli and the capillaries have. And so the utility of that is that you don't need any energy to do that. It's just the pressure of the gases alone, which is really useful, because if it came down to energy, you would end up getting very fatigued just from breathing, which would obviously be a problem, because then eventually you would die, right? Or you become extremely exhausted very quickly. So that's why it's so useful to have them only 1 cell thick. The other benefit is that you can then have loads of them, okay? Because they're so small, you can have loads of these structures. And so then the surface area by which you can go through what we call this gaseous exchange increases. So you can get more oxygen coming in and then more carbon dioxide going out. Now, you can't really adapt the lungs all too much, but what you can adapt is the number of these capillaries that wrap around each alveoli. And that's a process of what's called angiogenesis. Okay, so it's the destruction and then the formation of new capillaries. And the way that you drive that adaptation is exercise. So cardiovascular training, weight training, and so on. Like if you imagine, if you're in the gym and you're doing loads and loads of bicep curls, you end up getting that kind of pump sensation in the muscle, right? So every time you contract the muscle, the blood flow stops, what we call occlusion. And then as soon as you relax, it releases. And we get this massive flow of blood coming back into the muscle. The force of that blood flow ruptures the capillaries. And therefore, the body's way of adapting to that is, well, let's get more capillaries to handle the increased blood flow. And that basically occurs as well with cardiovascular training too. So that's how you get fitter, or at least one of the mechanisms by which you get fitter. So we have oxygen coming in from the lungs. As I say, they diffuse into the capillaries. So now the carbon dioxide from those red blood vessels goes out, oxygen comes in, and the whole process starts again. Blood flow then comes back into the pulmonary veins, into the left atrium, into the left ventricle, back out to the body. Again, I hope that makes sense. It's very disconcerting just talking to my laptop. Normally I have people's faces in front of me and I can see some people falling asleep, or some people are really engaged, some people look confused and frightened. Any questions, I can go over this 10 times and make additional lectures if need be. Okay, so don't freak out if I'm going too fast. So the blood flow goes, so the oxygenated blood, this is the oxygen going into the blood, now goes out to the rest of the body. Systemic circulation. Okay. And here's that in summary. So O2 rich blood from the lungs, left atrium, well, so first the pulmonary veins, left atrium, left ventricle, huge contraction from the left ventricle out of the aorta to the working muscles. All right. Now, all the oxygen's being used up in the muscles. We then get this deoxygenated blood, which is now carrying carbon dioxide. They go into the superior and inferior vena cava, into the right atrium, into the right ventricle, strong contraction from the right ventricle, out through the pulmonary artery, back into the lungs, ready for this gaseous exchange to take place again. Okay? And this is what we call pulmonary circulation, okay, to the lungs. So be real clear in your minds about the distinction between those two. Systemic circulation, blood goes to the body, the system. Pulmonary circulation, blood goes to the lungs, back to the heart again. So like I sort of alluded to, we have a variety of blood vessels. The biggest, thickest, and strongest are the arteries, because they're the ones that are able to contract. Therefore, thinking about our general adaptation syndrome, if they are exposed to more and greater stress, they will have more potential for adaptation. Okay, so the fact that they're having to contract means that they have bigger and thicker muscular walls, which is very useful because that can help pump the blood, obviously, around the whole body. We then have veins, which take blood from the organs or the muscles back to the heart. Now, the problem with veins is that they're not able to contract. All right, so they got to come up with other mechanisms of getting the blood flow back up to the heart again, which isn't always easy. If you've ever sat on a plane for a long period of time, you're at greater risk of things called deep vein thrombosis, because the blood essentially pools in your legs because you're not moving anymore. All right, and there isn't any sort of contractile element to the veins which can pump the blood back up. So that can be very annoying, particularly if it gets to a point where you start forming blood clots, because that can kill you. And then we have these little capillaries, which I spoke about before. So 1 cell thick, teeny tiny, but that's very useful because it allows for a lot of what we call diffusion. So either of oxygen going into the muscles, carbon dioxide coming out, or like I just mentioned then, when they're around the alveoli, of taking oxygen in and giving carbon dioxide back out. Little summary slide there. So again, be super clear on that because there's always a question on it. So then we need to think, okay, well, how do we solve this problem of venous return? Meaning, how do we get blood coming back up to the heart if the veins can't contract? Well, there's a bunch of different mechanisms. We have the actions of skeletal muscle. So like I described before, whenever you contract a muscle, it temporarily halts blood flow to that muscle, okay, which is what we call occlusion. So it occludes blood flow. Now, if I constantly contract and relax, the muscle contraction serves as a pump to send blood back up to the heart again, which is why they give the recommendation on planes that you should get up and walk around, okay, because it helps reduce that blood pooling around the lower body. We then have the actions of smooth muscles. So for instance, even just the pumping of the heart itself is usually enough to kind of like kickstart the veins. So if you imagine loads of arteries just firing blood, obviously down the arterial walls, some of the force from that is enough to kind of push the blood along in the veins as well. We then have the actions of the diaphragm, which we'll get into in a second with the respiratory lecture. So basically, as you breathe in and out, obviously your rib cage is expanding and then contracting again. And that creates a suction effect on the blood in your veins, allowing it to come back up to the heart. We then have a little bit of suction coming in from the right atrium. So as soon as the blood leaves the right atrium into the right ventricle, there's obviously a little bit of a vacuum there, right? There's no blood anymore in the right atrium. So as soon as it opens back up again, obviously blood flows back in and it creates like a suction effect. And then we also have these little non-return valves that sit in the veins. So as blood flow moves through the vein, these valves will kick into gear and they will stop the backflow of blood from just kind of pooling back down to where it's just come from. And then obviously gravity as well. So a classic example of that is if you've ever fainted or seen somebody faint, and actually this is probably useful to know when you're in the gym as well, if somebody starts feeling really lightheaded, one thing you do is you get them to lie down on the floor and then lift their legs up. And what happens is that obviously gravity then acts on the blood and it starts pulling back down to the top half of your body. Again, remembering the legs are up in the air. Now blood's returning back to the heart and it's returning back to the brain. And that's why you then feel better. All right. If you're feeling particularly faint. Okay. So blood pressure. So important to know because, well, certainly for your exams, when you come to level 3, you're going to be doing client consultations. And part of that is going to be taking blood pressure. And really it's what you should do prior to signing up a new client. All right. So we have 2 different types of blood pressure. We have systolic pressure, which is basically the pressure exerted when the heart is contracting. And then we have diastolic pressure, the pressure exerted when the heart is between contractions. So just think contraction and then relaxation. So when you look at a blood pressure monitor, the top number will be the systolic, and that will be the higher figure. And then the diastolic number will be underneath, usually at a lower figure. So the optimal is 120 systolic and 80 diastolic. We then have what we call total peripheral resistance, which basically just means the resistance of the blood vessels against the flow of blood. So if you spent your time eating loads of McDonald's and loads of nefarious, unhealthy nutrients, you can oftentimes get an increase in the plaque buildup, okay, due to an increase in inflammation in your arteries. And what will happen is that your arteries slowly start to narrow. And so what that is basically doing is increasing blood pressure because it's now adding way more resistance to blood flow, because obviously there is less room by which the blood can flow into, right? You've shortened the road. Kind of like what happens with a traffic jam. Like you ever go on Sheikh Zayed and somebody has an accident and suddenly the entire mass of traffic on the highway is now being bottlenecked into just a couple of lanes. You get this backlog of cars. So the exact same thing happens. And so that's what we call total peripheral resistance. Now, in order to find that blood pressure, you have to multiply the total peripheral resistance by the cardiac output. So if you remember, cardiac output was stroke volume, so the amount of blood that can be pumped in one beat times beats per minute. Okay, now that's cardiac output. If you times that by the total peripheral resistance, we get this measure in blood pressure. All right, that's how you work it out. So again, be very clear on that equation as well. We're now just going to cover the respiratory system, which obviously links in intimately with the circulatory system, as I've kind of already alluded to. The respiratory system covers a bunch of different structures. We have the pharynx up at the top, so kind of like where your throat is. We then have the larynx, which is kind of like this smaller tube down here. And then we have this big, thick tube called your trachea. All right. Now, what happens then is you split off into your right and left lung. And then you get this tree-like structure in each lung. So if you imagine a tree, the trunk of the tree is called the bronchus. Then the branches of the tree are what you would call your bronchioles or bronchioles. And then the leaves of the tree are the tiny air sacs called alveoli that I spoke about before. All right. So a nice little system by which we can get obviously oxygen from the atmosphere into our lungs, into our blood, and then obviously a mechanism by which we can get rid of the carbon dioxide. Okay. Now, as I've already alluded to again in the previous lecture, we have this mechanism of breathing. So you have this big muscle called your diaphragm. When it contracts, kind of closes in the rib cage, which allows inspiration to take place, assuming that you're breathing correctly, right? Which is, again, it's kind of an underrated topic, particularly in exercise. Like, how do we breathe, or how should we breathe? I'm sure those of you who are yogis or have spent time doing Pilates kind of know that we're supposed to really inspire and breathe into our bellies and kind of out to the side. So we're not getting so much of a contraction coming via the rib cage. All right. Whereas what tends to happen if you're in a highly stressful state is you'll start sort of breathing from the chest, and you'll notice that people's rib cages kind of expand and contract quite a bit. The shoulders start going up and down quite a lot as well. And if you do that chronically and over time, you start to get all of these postural abnormalities start to take place. So your chest starts getting a bit tighter. Muscles between your ribs, which we're not really mentioning here, but which are called your intercostals, they'll get tighter as well. And then suddenly breathing can actually become quite difficult. So we're inhaling, big belly full of breath. And then during expiration, the diaphragm then contracts to release the air that you've got in your lungs. Okay. And that's the thing that allows you to kind of get a full inhalation, maximum use of your lung capacity, which again is kind of a rare thing in this day and age. And it's extremely relieving and relaxing when you do get back to that appropriate kind of breathing mechanics. And that's essentially what meditation is, right? I mean, when you're just focusing on your breath. So if you do find yourself in a heightened stress response, like we spoke about before, just taking some time to just go through a few full deep breaths can be very useful. So again, like I said to you before, we have this process of gaseous exchange, which we also call diffusion as well, if you remember, again, back to your chemistry lessons at school. So gaseous exchange takes place in the alveoli, which are again these air sacs located at the end of the bronchioles, so the leaves attached to the branches. And then again, we have this process of what's called Dalton's law, where we kind of flood oxygen into our alveoli, and then just the pressure of the gas alone is enough to create this diffusion where oxygen can pass into the red blood cells, and then carbon dioxide can come from the red blood cells into the alveoli, which again is very useful because they're so small that it doesn't require ATP, doesn't require energy for that exchange, which is useful because otherwise you'd die because you'd be too tired all the time. You just get fatigued from breathing. And then obviously the fact that they're so small means that we can have loads of them, all right, which is very useful for getting loads of oxygen into your system and getting carbon dioxide out. So the definition, so diffusion is the movement of a substance from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. When we're talking about blood and liquids, this is obviously called osmosis. But when we're talking about gas, it's diffusion. Okay, so in summary, oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the blood to be transported around the body. Carbon dioxide, we consider to be the waste product of cellular respiration, diffuses from the blood into the alveoli to then be exhaled. And then here's that diagram again. So you can take little pictures of that if need be. Again, I'll send the slides out. Like I said before, this is one of the mechanisms by which you get fitter. So when you have your clients running on a treadmill for 20 minutes or doing high volume weight training, we end up creating what's called angiogenesis, where we just get more capillaries wrapped around the alveoli. Unfortunately, the lungs don't really adapt to training. Like you tend to just be stuck with what you've got in terms of your sheer lung size and lung capacity. The thing that changes are more capillaries, and then your muscles obviously get way better at being able to take out that oxygen as well, because again, there are more capillaries within your muscle too. So more capillaries around the alveoli, more capillaries around the muscle, more roads by which blood can flow. Therefore, more opportunity and more potential for gaseous exchange to take place. And then the reverse, obviously carbon dioxide going back out again. And this is really where you're losing your fat. So it was always kind of a bit of a myth that fat would come out in your sweat. There's actually a very good TED talk which explains exactly what takes place in your muscles and in your body when you're burning fat. Basically, the end result is essentially that you breathe it out. It gets changed into carbon dioxide. So that's a worthwhile TED talk. For the life of me, I can't remember the guy's name. I'll try and find it for you and then put it up on WhatsApp. And then last slide. So just the general composition of air. 21% oxygen. Obviously, most of it is nitrogen at 79%. And then we have a tiny fraction of carbon dioxide as well in our inhaled air. We tend to exhale about 17% oxygen and 4% carbon dioxide. So it's not like a nice, neat relationship. It's not like when you breathe in, you use all of your oxygen, or when you breathe out, you get rid of all of your carbon dioxide. There's always a little bit that gets left over. And that's kind of one of the rebuttals against using things like those oxygen masks. I can't remember the name of them now. You know, the masks that you see like the crazy cardio people use to try and hold airflow. You don't really get too much in the way of adaptation from that, because the concentration of oxygen in the air remains the same. So all you're doing is slightly reducing airflow. Because one of the reasons why athletes obviously train at altitude is that this relationship changes. Okay, and in response to the decreased oxygen at high altitudes, you end up getting this massive cardiovascular adaptation whereby way more red blood cells are formed. And I seem to remember there being research saying that angiogenesis takes place a bit more as well. That's the reason why they go up high. But that only remains for a certain amount of time. As soon as you come back down again to sea level, everything returns to normal. And so if you ever are lucky enough to work with an Olympic athlete who goes through this type of training, you have to be very sophisticated with when you decide to train and when you decide to compete, because it returns to normal real fast, and you don't get the same changes by reducing just airflow. Although you might get a little bit, the body's pretty good at figuring out ways to adapt to whatever you decide to do to it. It's just not the same thing, unfortunately. Although it looks cool, and people use it for Instagram and get loads of likes, and each to their own. We're not here to judge. All right, so hopefully now you can identify the location of the lungs. Hopefully that was obvious in the rib cage. You can describe the function of the lungs, at least just those kind of simplistic levels. And again, if you're confused or you didn't really catch what I was saying, review the recordings, look at your manuals as well, because all of these slides are just summaries of what's in the manual. Except my stories, obviously. So look, I hope that was enjoyable. I hope it was interesting. I hope you managed to stay with me and that the connection wasn't too bad. So cheers, guys. Tomorrow, I can't remember what we're actually going over. I think we're going to be doing the nervous system tomorrow. So have a little read up on the nervous system just so you're prepared. And then I will see you at 6 p.m. tomorrow evening. All right. Cheers, guys.